The physician's hand trembled as he pushed open the bedroom door of the Whitmore estate on that humid August morning in 1857, and what greeted him in the darkness beyond would haunt his professional conscience for the remainder of his days. A human being, 7 feet tall, folded into a space barely large enough for a child's cot, his magnificent frame reduced to angles and atrophy, his eyes reflecting not madness but a terrible, patient intelligence that had survived 3 years of deliberate erasure. Dr. Samuel Hendricks had been summoned under the pretense of treating the widow for nervous complaints, but the muffled sounds emanating from the locked upper chamber had compelled him to investigate, and now he stood face to face with a crime so methodical, so sustained in its cruelty, that it would force an entire county to confront the depths of depravity that the institution of slavery permitted behind closed doors, in respectable homes, under the protection of law and social standing. Before we continue with what Dr. Hendricks discovered in that room and how his testimony would eventually reach the state legislature, I need you to understand something crucial about why these stories matter and why they must be shared. If you believe that the full truth of our history deserves to be told, that the humanity of those who suffered must be honored through remembrance, subscribe to this channel right now. And in the comments, I want you to write the word "remember" followed by where you're watching from, because this isn't just a story from the past. It's a testament to survival that connects us across time and geography. The algorithm will only show these histories to more people if you engage, so your participation is how we keep these voices alive. Now let's go back to where this nightmare began, because understanding how a widow came to purchase a man specifically for his extraordinary height, and why she chose to imprison him in conditions that defied every claim of paternalistic care that slaveholders used to justify their dominion, requires us to examine the intersection of property law, social vulnerability, and the particular pathologies that absolute power over human beings could produce. Margaret Whitmore had become a widow in the spring of 1854 when her husband, Thomas Whitmore, a moderately successful tobacco factor in Lynchburg, Virginia, succumbed to pneumonia at the age of 49. The estate he left behind was substantial by local standards: a 3-story brick townhouse on Court Street, financial interests in 2 warehouses along the James River, and liquid assets totaling approximately $8,000, a sum that placed Margaret firmly in the upper tier of the town's social hierarchy. But Thomas Whitmore's will contained a provision that would prove catastrophic in its consequences. It granted Margaret full and unconditional control over all property, including the 11 enslaved people who worked in the household, and warehouses with no male relative appointed as executor or advisor. In the patriarchal structure of antebellum Virginia society, this was unusual but not unprecedented. Thomas had no brothers, and his 2 adult sons from a previous marriage had relocated to New Orleans, leaving Margaret, at 42 years old, as the sole authority over a considerable estate, and the human beings legally classified as its chattels. The records of the Lynchburg slave market, preserved in the city's archives, show that Margaret Whitmore made her first independent purchase in November of 1854, 7 months after her husband's death. She acquired a young woman named Celia for $600, a transaction noted by the auctioneer as unremarkable, save for the buyer's insistence on examining the merchandise's teeth and hands with unusual thoroughness. Over the following 18 months, Margaret sold 4 of the enslaved people she had inherited, all men, all sold to traders heading to the deep South markets where prices were higher, and used the proceeds to purchase 3 women and 2 children. The pattern was clear to those who paid attention. Margaret Whitmore was systematically restructuring her human property holdings to eliminate adult males from her household, replacing them with women and children who posed no physical threat, and whose labor could be more easily controlled within the domestic sphere. But in April of 1856, Margaret Whitmore did something that broke her established pattern and attracted notice throughout Lynchburg's commercial district. She attended a special auction held by the firm of Pulliam and Davis, slave traders who specialized in what they euphemistically termed remarkable specimens, enslaved people whose unusual physical characteristics or skills commanded premium prices from buyers seeking novelty, spectacle, or specific capacities. The man on the auction block that day was named Joshua, and he stood 7 feet and 2 inches tall, his frame proportioned with such symmetry that he appeared not grotesque but magnificent, a physical presence that commanded attention and inspired awe. He was 24 years old, born on a plantation in the Tidewater region, and had been sold away from his family after his master's death, left the estate in financial disarray. The auctioneer's ledger records that bidding opened at $1,000 and climbed rapidly, with Margaret Whitmore ultimately securing Joshua for the extraordinary sum of $2,300, nearly 4 times the average price for a prime field hand, and more than she had received for selling all 4 of the men from her inherited property combined. The purchase raised eyebrows among Lynchburg's slave-owning class, not because the price was exorbitant. Unusual physical specimens did command premiums, but because Margaret Whitmore had no obvious use for a man of Joshua's size and strength. She operated no plantation requiring heavy labor, maintained no commercial enterprise that would benefit from his physical capacity, and had explicitly divested herself of male slaves in favor of domestic servants. Speculation ran through the town's parlors and counting houses. Was she planning to hire him out for construction work? Had she purchased him as an investment to be resold at profit in New Orleans or Charleston? Was this a vanity purchase, a widow's attempt to display her wealth and independence through the acquisition of human property that would attract notice and conversation? The truth, which would not emerge until Dr. Hendricks forced open that bedroom door more than a year later, was far darker than mere vanity or investment strategy. Margaret Whitmore had purchased Joshua for a purpose that existed entirely outside the economic and social frameworks that typically governed slave ownership, a purpose rooted in psychological needs and pathological impulses that the absolute power of ownership permitted her to pursue without restraint or accountability. Within 2 weeks of the purchase, Joshua disappeared from public view entirely. He was not seen working in the Whitmore household, not observed on errands in town, not hired out to any of the construction projects or warehouse operations that typically employed enslaved men in urban settings. When neighbors inquired, Margaret offered vague explanations. He was ill. He was being trained for specialized work. He was temperamental and required isolation until properly disciplined. The explanations were accepted because they conformed to the prevailing logic of slavery. Enslaved people were property, and what an owner did with her property behind closed doors was her own affair, protected by law and social custom from scrutiny or interference. What was actually happening behind those closed doors, in the locked bedroom on the 3rd floor of the Whitmore house, was a systematic program of confinement and control that reduced Joshua from a man of extraordinary physical capacity to a prisoner whose world measured 12 feet by 14 feet, whose days blurred into an endless succession of darkness and isolation, broken only by Margaret Whitmore's visits. She had converted the bedroom, originally a storage room for seasonal clothing and household linens, into a cell, removing all furniture except a narrow cot designed for a child, installing a heavy oak door with external bolts, and covering the single window with boards nailed directly into the frame. Joshua's height made the space even more confining. He could not stand fully upright without his head touching the ceiling, could not lie down on the cot without his legs hanging over the edge, could not pace more than 3 steps in any direction. The room's dimensions forced him into a permanent state of physical compression. His body folded and bent in ways that defied its natural proportions, his muscles adapting to confinement rather than movement, his frame slowly collapsing under the weight of enforced stillness. Margaret Whitmore visited the room 3 times daily, bringing food and water, emptying the chamber pot, and conducting what she described in the diary later seized by authorities as sessions of instruction and correction. These sessions, detailed in her handwriting with disturbing precision, reveal a woman who had constructed an elaborate psychological framework to justify and systematize her treatment of Joshua. She believed, or claimed to believe, that his extraordinary height was a manifestation of dangerous pride and physical arrogance that required suppression through humiliation and constraint. She recorded her observations of his progress toward proper humility, noting with satisfaction when he learned to remain silent during her visits, when he adopted postures of submission, when his eyes no longer met hers with what she interpreted as defiance. The diary entries are chilling in their clinical detachment, describing a human being's systematic degradation with the same tone one might use to document the training of an animal or the cultivation of a garden. But the diary also reveals something else, something that complicates the simple narrative of sadistic cruelty. Margaret Whitmore was profoundly lonely, isolated by her widowhood and her wealth, trapped in a social position that granted her power over others but denied her genuine human connection. Her entries describe Joshua not just as property to be controlled, but as a presence that filled the emptiness of her house, a being whose very existence, even in confinement, provided her with a sense of purpose and occupation. She writes of sitting outside the locked door for hours, listening to the sounds of his breathing, imagining conversations they might have if he were properly reformed, fantasizing about a future in which his confinement would transform him into a grateful, devoted servant who would never leave her, never betray her, never expose her to the vulnerability of abandonment. The pathology is complex, a twisted fusion of the power dynamics inherent in slavery with the emotional desperation of a woman whose social position isolated her from authentic relationships, who had learned to exercise control over human beings as a substitute for genuine intimacy. Joshua, meanwhile, endured. The physical toll of his confinement was severe and progressive. Denied sunlight, his body's ability to produce vitamin D collapsed, leading to a softening of his bones that caused chronic pain in his joints and spine. The enforced stillness atrophied his muscles, reducing the magnificent physique that had commanded such a high price at auction to a wasted frame that struggled to support its own weight. The inadequate nutrition Margaret provided, she believed that generous feeding would encourage resistance and that hunger promoted docility, left him in a state of perpetual semi-starvation, his body consuming its own tissues to survive. But perhaps most devastating was the sensory deprivation, the darkness, the silence, the absence of any stimulus beyond the walls of his cell, and the brief, terrible visits from his captor. Human beings require sensory input to maintain psychological stability, and Joshua's world had been reduced to a void punctuated only by suffering. Yet he did not break. The intelligence that Dr. Hendricks would later observe in Joshua's eyes, that terrible patient intelligence, was the product of a survival strategy that Joshua had developed during those 3 years of confinement. He had learned to preserve his sanity by constructing an internal world, a mental landscape populated with memories of his family, his childhood, the Tidewater plantation where he had been born, the fields he had worked, the songs he had sung, the people he had loved. He recited these memories to himself in the darkness, speaking them aloud in whispers when Margaret was not present, using language as a tether to his humanity, a reminder that he existed beyond the boundaries of his cell. He counted days by tracking the subtle changes in temperature and air quality that marked the passage of seasons, maintaining a calendar in his mind that allowed him to measure time and resist the temporal dissolution that prolonged isolation produces. He exercised his mind by solving mathematical problems, reciting Bible verses he had memorized before literacy was forbidden to him, composing songs and stories that he would never be able to share, but that kept his consciousness active and engaged. This mental discipline was not mere distraction, it was resistance. Every moment that Joshua maintained his sense of self, every memory he preserved, every calculation he completed in the darkness was an act of defiance against Margaret Whitmore's attempt to reduce him to a blank slate, a possession without history or agency. He understood, with a clarity born of desperation, that his survival depended not just on physical endurance, but on psychological resilience, on refusing to internalize the degradation that was being inflicted upon him, on maintaining the knowledge that he was a human being with dignity and worth, regardless of what the law said, regardless of what his owner believed, regardless of the conditions to which he had been subjected. The situation might have continued indefinitely. Margaret Whitmore showed no signs of releasing Joshua, and Virginia law provided no mechanism for enslaved people to seek relief from. Mistreatment, no matter how severe, had it not been for the intervention of Dr. Samuel Hendricks. Hendricks was a respected physician in Lynchburg, 47 years old, educated at the University of Pennsylvania's medical school, and known for his progressive views on public health and sanitation. He was not an abolitionist. He owned 2 enslaved people himself, a cook and a houseman, but he subscribed to the paternalistic ideology that slaveholders had duties as well as rights, that the ownership of human beings imposed moral obligations to provide adequate care and humane treatment. When Margaret Whitmore summoned him in August of 1857 to treat her for what she described as nervous exhaustion and insomnia, he arrived at the Court Street house with his medical bag and his professional assumptions about the nature of the call. Margaret received him in the parlor, a room decorated with heavy furniture and thick draperies that blocked the summer light, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. She described her symptoms with precision: difficulty sleeping, heart palpitations, a sense of being watched, intrusive thoughts that disturbed her concentration. Hendricks conducted his examination, noting her elevated pulse and the dark circles under her eyes, and was preparing to prescribe laudanum and bed rest when he heard it. A sound from above, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the 3rd floor, followed by what might have been a human voice, though so muffled and distorted that he could not be certain. He paused, listening, and saw Margaret's face tighten with what he would later describe as a mixture of fear and defiance. "What was that sound?" he asked, his professional curiosity overriding social etiquette. Margaret's response was immediate and defensive. "Nothing of consequence. The house settles in the heat. Old buildings make all manner of noises, but Hendricks had lived in Lynchburg long enough to know the sounds of settling timber, and what he had heard was neither random nor structural. Mrs. Whitmore, I must insist, if there is someone ill in this house, it is my duty as a physician to offer assistance." The confrontation that followed revealed the limits of Margaret's control. She could command Joshua absolutely within the confines of his cell, could structure his existence according to her will, but she could not command a white physician, could not prevent him from investigating without exposing herself to questions she could not answer. When Hendricks insisted on inspecting the upper floors, citing his professional obligation and threatening to involve the county health officer if she refused, Margaret capitulated with a condition. He could look, but he must understand that what he saw was her property, her affair, and that any interference would be met with legal action. Hendricks climbed the stairs to the third floor, following the sounds that had now become more distinct. A human voice, definitely, speaking or perhaps singing in tones so low they were almost subsonic. Margaret followed, producing a key ring and unlocking the heavy oak door with hands that shook despite her attempts at composure. The smell hit Hendricks first. Human waste, unwashed flesh, the sickly sweet odor of infection, all concentrated in the enclosed space and released in a wave when the door swung open. Then his eyes adjusted to the darkness and he saw Joshua. The man was seated on the edge of the cot, his body folded in on itself, his knees drawn up because the cot was too short to accommodate his legs, his head bowed because the ceiling was too low to permit him to sit upright. His skin, which had once been the deep brown of polished walnut, had taken on a grayish pallor, the color of someone who had not seen sunlight in years. His muscles, visible beneath skin that seemed stretched too thin, showed the wasting characteristic of prolonged immobility and malnutrition. His feet were bare and covered with sores where the skin had broken down from constant pressure against the cot's rough surface. His hands, resting on his knees, trembled with a fine tremor that Hendricks recognized as a neurological symptom, possibly from vitamin deficiency or nerve damage. But it was Joshua's eyes that struck Hendricks most forcefully. They were clear, focused, and utterly sane. Not the vacant stare of someone whose mind had collapsed under the weight of isolation, but the gaze of someone who had endured and survived, who had maintained his humanity through an ordeal that would have destroyed most people. When those eyes met Hendricks's, the physician felt a jolt of recognition and shame. This was not a broken thing, not a mindless piece of property, but a human being who had suffered with dignity and who now looked at him with an expression that combined hope, wariness, and a terrible patience. Hendricks turned to Margaret, his professional composure barely containing his horror. "How long has this man been confined in this room?" "That is not your concern," Margaret replied, her voice tight. "He is my property, purchased legally, and how I choose to manage my property is protected by law. The law does not permit torture, Mrs. Whitmore. This man requires immediate medical attention. He is suffering from malnutrition, vitamin deficiency, probable bone disease, and infections that could prove fatal if left untreated. He is fed adequately. He has shelter. He is not beaten. I have violated no statute," the exchange revealed. The central horror of the situation. Margaret Whitmore was technically correct. Virginia law in 1857 provided enslaved people with virtually no protections against mistreatment by their owners. The state's slave code prohibited only the most extreme forms of violence, maiming, deliberate murder, and even those prohibitions were rarely enforced. Confinement, inadequate nutrition, denial of medical care, psychological abuse, none of these constituted crimes when inflicted upon someone legally classified as property. The paternalistic ideology that supposedly governed slavery, the claim that slaveholders had duties to care for their human property, was revealed as a fiction, a rhetorical construct with no legal force, no mechanism of enforcement, no reality beyond the voluntary choices of individual owners. But Hendricks was not willing to accept this legal reality as the final word. He was a physician bound by professional ethics that predated and superseded the laws of Virginia, ethics that required him to relieve suffering regardless of the patient's legal status. He informed Margaret that he would be reporting the situation to the County Medical Society and that he expected her to permit him to provide treatment to Joshua immediately. Margaret, recognizing that outright refusal would only intensify scrutiny, agreed to allow Hendricks to examine Joshua and provide basic care. But she insisted that the man remain in the room. that his confinement continue, and that Hendricks sign a document acknowledging that he was treating her property at her request and that she bore no liability for the patient's condition. Over the following weeks, Hendricks visited the Whitmore house daily, bringing medicines, nutritious foods, and clean bandages. He treated Joshua's infections, supplemented his diet with liver and fresh vegetables to address the vitamin deficiencies, and gradually coaxed his patient's body back from the edge of complete systemic failure. But the treatment was complicated by the ongoing confinement. Hendricks could address the immediate medical crises, but he could not reverse the damage being done by Joshua's continued imprisonment in conditions that violated every principle of health and human dignity. He argued with Margaret, pleaded with her to at least move Joshua to a larger room with windows, to permit him some exercise, to allow him to recover in conditions that would not immediately undo whatever medical progress was achieved. Margaret refused every request, insisting that Joshua's confinement was necessary for his correction and that any relaxation of control would result in violence or escape. Frustrated by Margaret's intransigence and disturbed by the legal vacuum that permitted such treatment, Hendricks began documenting everything. He kept detailed medical records of Joshua's condition, noting every symptom, every measurement, every sign of the damage that prolonged confinement had inflicted. He recorded his conversations with Margaret, preserving her justifications and her refusals in his own handwriting. He took measurements of the room, documenting its dimensions and the impossibility of a 7-foot man maintaining health in such a space. And he began speaking quietly with other physicians, with clergy, with members of Lynchburg's professional class, who might be troubled by what was happening in Margaret Whitmore's house and who might be willing to support some form of intervention. The challenge was finding a legal mechanism for that intervention. Virginia law provided no avenue for removing enslaved people from abusive owners. The entire structure of slavery was predicated on the absolute authority of the owner over the owned, and any limitation on that authority threatened the institution's foundations. But Hendricks discovered a potential opening in the state's laws governing mental competency. If Margaret Whitmore could be declared mentally incompetent, her property, including Joshua, would be placed under the control of a court-appointed guardian who might be persuaded to sell Joshua to a more humane owner or at least improve his conditions. It was a long shot, requiring Hendricks to make a case that Margaret's treatment of Joshua demonstrated insanity rather than mere cruelty, but it was the only legal pathway available. In October of 1857, Hendricks filed a petition with the Lynchburg County Court requesting a competency hearing for Margaret Whitmore. The petition, preserved in the court's archives, is a remarkable document, carefully constructed to avoid directly challenging the institution of slavery while still conveying the horror of what was happening in the Whitmore house. Hendricks described Margaret's obsessive fixation on Joshua, her irrational belief that his height represented a moral defect requiring correction, her delusional conviction that prolonged confinement would transform him into an ideal servant. He presented his medical documentation of Joshua's condition as evidence not of Margaret's cruelty, but of her impaired judgment and inability to manage her affairs in a rational manner. He gathered testimony from neighbors who described Margaret's increasingly erratic behavior, her social isolation, her strange pronouncements about the need to reform her property through methods that defied economic logic and common sense. The hearing, held in November of 1857, became a public spectacle that divided Lynchburg society along unexpected lines. Some defended Margaret's right to manage her property as she saw fit, arguing that any interference would set a dangerous precedent that could undermine all slaveholders' authority. Others, troubled by the specific details of Joshua's confinement and persuaded by Hendricks's medical testimony, supported the competency petition as a necessary intervention in an extreme case. The judge, William Cable, was a slaveholder himself, deeply invested in the institution's preservation, but he was also a man who prided himself on his legal reasoning and his commitment to social order. The question before him was not whether slavery was just, that was settled law, but whether Margaret Whitmore's treatment of Joshua fell so far outside the bounds of acceptable practice that it demonstrated mental incompetence. The testimony lasted 3 days. Hendricks presented his medical evidence, describing Joshua's condition in clinical detail and explaining how the confinement had damaged his patient's body and health. He called other physicians to testify about the medical necessity of sunlight, exercise, and adequate nutrition, establishing that Margaret's treatment of Joshua violated basic principles of health care. He presented Margaret's diary, which the court had subpoenaed, reading aloud passages that revealed her psychological state and her justifications for Joshua's confinement. The diary entries, with their mixture of pseudo-scientific reasoning and emotional neediness, proved devastating to Margaret's case, painting a picture of a woman whose isolation and grief had twisted into something pathological. Margaret's attorney attempted to defend her by arguing that her treatment of Joshua, while unusual, was within her rights as an owner, and that her detailed record-keeping demonstrated rationality rather than insanity. He called witnesses who testified to Margaret's competence in managing her financial affairs, her coherent conversation on topics unrelated to Joshua, her ability to function in social settings when she chose to engage. He argued that the petition was an attempt to use mental competency law to impose abolitionist values on a lawful slaveholder, and that approving it would open the door to challenges against any owner whose treatment of enslaved people offended the sensibilities of meddling physicians. But the attorney's defense was undermined by Margaret herself. When called to testify, she spoke at length about her project of reforming Joshua, describing her methods with a pride and conviction that disturbed even those predisposed to support her. She explained that Joshua's height made him inherently dangerous, that his physical presence represented a challenge to proper order that required suppression through confinement and humiliation. She described her vision of Joshua's eventual transformation, a fantasy in which years of isolation would break his spirit completely, rendering him utterly dependent on her and grateful for her attention. She spoke of him not as a human being, but as a problem to be solved, an experiment in control, a possession whose value lay not in his labor, but in her ability to dominate him absolutely. The testimony revealed a mind that had constructed an elaborate rationalization for cruelty, a psychology so distorted by the absolute power that slavery granted that it could no longer distinguish between ownership and obsession, between discipline and torture. Judge Cabell issued his ruling on November 28, 1857. He found Margaret Whitmore mentally incompetent to manage her affairs and appointed a guardian, James Morrison, a respected attorney and distant cousin of Margaret's late husband, to assume control of her property and estate. The ruling was carefully worded to avoid any broader challenge to slavery. Cabell emphasized that he was not questioning the institution itself or the general right of owners to discipline their property, but rather finding that this specific individual had demonstrated impaired judgment that required intervention. It was a narrow ruling, applicable only to Margaret's case, but it achieved Hendricks's immediate goal. Joshua would be removed from his confinement and placed under new management. The day after the ruling, Morrison arrived at the Whitmore house with Hendricks and 2 constables. They climbed to the 3rd floor, unlocked the door, and entered the room where Joshua had spent 3 years and 4 months of his life. Joshua was sitting on the cot in his usual position, his body folded into the space that had become his entire world. When Morrison explained that he was being removed from the room, that he would be taken to a different location and provided with proper care, Joshua did not immediately respond. He sat in silence for a long moment, as if processing information that was too enormous to comprehend, and then he asked a single question: "Is this real?" The question, reported by Hendricks in his journal, captures the psychological impact of prolonged confinement and abuse. Joshua had endured by maintaining hope, by believing that his situation would eventually change, but 3 years of unrelieved suffering had taught him to distrust hope, to protect himself from disappointment by expecting nothing. The possibility of freedom from his cell was so overwhelming that he could not immediately accept it as real, could not allow himself to believe that his ordeal might actually be ending. Hendricks assured him that it was real, that he was being removed from the room immediately, that he would never be locked in that space again. Joshua stood, or attempted to stand. His legs, weakened by years of disuse, could barely support his weight. His back, compressed by the low ceiling and the inadequate cot, could not straighten fully. He took a step toward the door and stumbled, his body having forgotten how to walk, his muscles unable to execute movements they had once performed effortlessly. Morrison and one of the constables moved to support him, each taking an arm, and together they helped Joshua navigate the doorway, the stairs, the journey from the 3rd floor to the ground level, and out into the street where a wagon waited to transport him to the county hospital. The sunlight hit Joshua like a physical blow. After 3 years in darkness, his eyes could not process the intensity of natural light, and he raised his hands to shield his face, squinting against the brightness that was simultaneously painful and glorious. Hendricks noted that Joshua wept, tears streaming down his face as he stood in the street, supported by the 2 men, experiencing the simple reality of open air and sunlight for the first time in more than 1,000 days. The physician could not determine whether the tears were from physical pain, emotional release, or some combination of both, but he understood that he was witnessing a moment of profound significance, a human being's emergence from a hell that should never have existed, that the law had permitted, that only the narrowest of legal technicalities had finally ended. Joshua's recovery was slow and incomplete. At the county hospital, Hendricks and his colleagues worked to reverse the damage that confinement had inflicted, providing nutrition, sunlight, physical therapy to rebuild wasted muscles and restore mobility. Joshua's bones, softened by vitamin D deficiency, required months of treatment and would never fully regain their original strength. His vision, damaged by prolonged darkness, remained impaired, leaving him with permanent sensitivity to bright light and difficulty with depth perception. His psychological recovery was even more complex. He suffered from nightmares, from moments of panic when in enclosed spaces, from a wariness of human contact that reflected the trauma of his confinement. But he also demonstrated remarkable resilience, engaging with his treatment, learning to walk again, gradually rebuilding the physical capacity that Margaret Whitmore had systematically destroyed. The legal aftermath of the case extended far beyond Joshua's personal recovery. Morrison, as guardian of Margaret's estate, faced the question of what to do with Joshua and the other enslaved people under his control. Virginia law required him to manage the property in Margaret's financial interest, which suggested selling Joshua and the others to maximize the estate's value. But Morrison was troubled by the case, disturbed by what he had seen in that 3rd floor room, and he sought legal advice on whether he had any discretion to consider factors beyond pure financial return. The answer was ambiguous. Guardianship law gave him some latitude to make decisions based on the ward's overall welfare, which could arguably include avoiding actions that would bring public scandal or moral condemnation on the estate. In the end, Morrison negotiated a compromise that satisfied neither abolitionists nor slavery's staunchest defenders, but that achieved a measure of practical justice. He sold Joshua to a Quaker merchant from Pennsylvania who had connections in Lynchburg's business community and who agreed to pay a fair market price, with the understanding that Joshua would be manumitted once they crossed into free territory. The transaction was legal under Virginia law, which permitted owners to sell enslaved people out of state, and the manumission would occur in Pennsylvania, where it was lawful and would not violate Virginia's increasingly restrictive emancipation statutes. Joshua left Virginia in February of 1858, traveling north with his new owner, and was formally freed in Philadelphia on March 3, 1858, becoming a free man at the age of 26. His freedom purchased not through his own agency, but through the intervention of a physician's conscience and a legal system's narrow exception to its own brutal logic. The case attracted attention beyond Lynchburg. Newspapers in Richmond, Baltimore, and even New York reported on the Whitmore affair, with varying interpretations depending on the publication's stance on slavery. Southern papers generally emphasized Judge Cabell's careful limitation of his ruling, praising him for addressing an extreme case of individual incompetence without challenging the institution of slavery itself. Northern papers focused on the horror of Joshua's confinement, using the case as evidence of slavery's inherent cruelty and the inadequacy of legal protections for enslaved people. Abolitionist publications seized on Hendricks's testimony and the details from Margaret's diary, reprinting them as proof that slavery corrupted slaveholders morally and psychologically, transforming ordinary people into monsters capable of sustained methodical cruelty. Dr. Hendricks himself became a controversial figure. Some in Lynchburg's medical community praised his intervention as an example of professional ethics, overriding social convention, while others criticized him for overstepping his role and using a medical competency petition to achieve what was essentially an abolitionist goal. Hendricks defended his actions in a letter published in the Lynchburg Virginian in March of 1858, arguing that he had acted purely on medical and humanitarian grounds, that he had no abolitionist sympathies, and that he had simply fulfilled his duty as a physician to relieve suffering when he encountered it. But his defense was complicated by his own evolving views, the experience of treating Joshua, of witnessing the damage that absolute power over human beings could inflict, had shaken his faith in the paternalistic ideology that supposedly made slavery humane. He did not become an abolitionist in the political sense, but he could no longer comfortably accept the institution's moral legitimacy, and his private correspondence from this period reveals a man grappling with contradictions he could not resolve. Margaret Whitmore lived for another 18 years, dying in 1875 at the age of 63. She spent the remainder of her life under Morrison's guardianship, her competency never restored, her property managed by others. She lived quietly in a smaller house purchased by the guardian, attended by a single servant, isolated from the society that had once accepted her as a respectable widow of means. There is no evidence that she ever acknowledged wrongdoing or expressed remorse for her treatment of Joshua. Her diary entries from the years after the hearing, preserved in the Morrison family papers, suggest that she continued to believe she had been unjustly persecuted, that her project of reforming Joshua had been misunderstood by people who lacked the vision to appreciate her methods. She died believing herself a victim of interference and ingratitude, her psychology so thoroughly shaped by the absolute power slavery had granted her that she could not recognize the humanity of the man she had tortured, or the enormity of what she had done. Joshua's life after emancipation is less completely documented, but the records that survive paint a picture of a man who rebuilt his life with determination and dignity. He settled in Philadelphia, where the city's substantial free black community provided support and opportunity. He worked initially as a laborer, his physical strength gradually returning, though never fully recovering to what it had been before his confinement. He learned to read and write, skills that had been forbidden to him in Virginia, attending evening classes at a school operated by the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. In 1862, he enlisted in the United States Colored Troops, serving in the 6th Regiment and participating in several major engagements of the Civil War. His service record, preserved in the National Archives, notes his unusual height and includes a commendation for bravery during the Battle of Olustee in Florida, where he helped evacuate wounded soldiers under fire. After the war, Joshua returned to Philadelphia and married a woman named Sarah, a former slave from Maryland who had escaped to freedom via the Underground Railroad. They had 4 children, and Joshua worked as a carpenter, a trade he learned during Reconstruction and practiced for the remainder of his working life. He was active in his church, in veterans organizations, and in efforts to support newly freed people migrating north from the former Confederacy. He lived to the age of 67, dying in 1899, and was buried in Eden Cemetery in Collingdale, Pennsylvania, where his gravestone identifies him as a Civil War veteran and a freeman. In 1895, 4 years before his death, Joshua gave an interview to a reporter from the Philadelphia Tribune, one of the nation's oldest African-American newspapers. The interview, published on June 15, 1895, is the only extensive first-person account of his experience in Margaret Whitmore's house. Joshua spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision, describing the physical conditions of his confinement and the psychological strategies he had used to survive. He talked about the importance of memory, of maintaining his sense of self through the deliberate recollection of his past, his family, his identity as a human being with history and dignity. He described the moment when Dr. Hendricks opened the door as a resurrection, a return to life from a death that had not quite killed him, and he spoke about forgiveness, not in the sense of excusing what had been done to him, but in the sense of refusing to let hatred consume the life he had reclaimed. "I do not forgive her," Joshua said, referring to Margaret Whitmore. "Forgiveness is not mine to grant for what she did. That is between her and God. But I will not let what she did define me. I was a man before she bought me. I remained a man in that room, and I am a man now. She tried to take that from me, and she failed. That is my victory, and it is enough." The interview concludes with Joshua's reflection on the meaning of his survival and his hope for future generations. "I want my children and their children to know what happened, not to carry hatred, but to understand the strength it took to endure, to remember that our people survived things that should have destroyed us, and that survival itself is a form of resistance. The records will show that I was property, that I was bought and sold, that I was locked in a room for 3 years. But the records will also show that I lived, that I fought, that I built a life in freedom. Both truths matter. Both must be remembered." The Whitmore case occupies a strange position in the historical record of American slavery. It is neither typical nor entirely exceptional. The specific circumstances of Joshua's confinement were unusual, but the underlying dynamics of absolute power, psychological pathology, and legal impunity were endemic to the institution. The case reveals how slavery's legal framework permitted virtually any treatment of enslaved people, limited only by the economic interests and personal inclinations of individual owners, and how even extreme cases of abuse could be addressed only through narrow legal technicalities that left the institution itself unchallenged. It demonstrates the courage required of people like Dr. Hendricks, who worked within a deeply unjust system to achieve small victories for individual human beings while lacking the power or will to challenge the system itself. and it testifies to the extraordinary resilience of people like Joshua, who endured unimaginable suffering and emerged with their humanity intact, who refused to be defined by what was done to them, who built lives of meaning and dignity despite everything the law and society had arrayed against them. The third-floor room in the Whitmore House on Court Street still exists. The building has changed hands many times since Margaret Whitmore's death, serving at various points as a boarding house, a law office, and currently as a private residence. The current owners, unaware of the building's history until researchers from the University of Virginia's Slavery Archives contacted them in 2018, have preserved the room largely as it was, though the boards over the window have been removed and the heavy oak door replaced with a standard modern door. The room measures 12 feet by 14 feet, with a ceiling height of 6 feet 8 inches, dimensions that make the space feel cramped for a person of average height and claustrophobic for anyone approaching Joshua's 7-foot 2-inch frame. Standing in that room, knowing its history, understanding what happened within those walls, produces a visceral horror that no amount of historical distance can diminish. In 2019, the Lynchburg Historical Society installed a marker outside the building, a bronze plaque that reads, "In this house from 1856 to 1857, an enslaved man named Joshua was confined in inhumane conditions by his owner, Margaret Whitmore. His suffering and survival, and the intervention of Dr. Samuel Hendricks, illuminate both the cruelties enabled by slavery and the courage of those who resisted." Joshua lived to freedom, served his country, and built a life of dignity. His story reminds us that behind every statistic of slavery stood human beings who endured, who resisted, and who claimed their humanity against a system designed to deny it. Remember Joshua. Honor his survival. Continue his resistance. The marker has become a site of pilgrimage for people interested in slavery's history, for descendants of enslaved people seeking connection to their ancestors' experiences, and for anyone trying to understand the full reality of America's original sin and the extraordinary resilience of those who survived it. Visitors leave flowers, notes, and small stones, a Jewish tradition of remembrance that has been adopted by many as a way of marking that someone has been there, has remembered, has honored the dead and the survivors. The accumulation of these tokens creates a small memorial, a physical manifestation of collective memory and ongoing reckoning. The case also raises questions that extend beyond its specific historical moment. Questions about power, about the psychological effects of absolute authority over other human beings, about the legal and social structures that enable abuse, and about the forms of resistance available to people trapped in systems designed to destroy them. Margaret Whitmore was not a monster in the sense of being fundamentally different from other slaveholders. She was a product of a system that granted her absolute power over human beings and provided no meaningful constraints on how she exercised that power. The pathology she developed, the obsessive need for control, and the elaborate justifications for cruelty were enabled and protected by slavery's legal framework. Her case suggests that the corruption of slavery was not limited to its most obviously brutal manifestations, the whippings, the family separations, the sexual violence, but extended to the psychological deformation of slaveholders themselves, who learned to see human beings as objects and to exercise power without accountability or restraint. Joshua's resistance, meanwhile, demonstrates that agency and dignity could survive even in conditions designed to eliminate them. His decision to maintain his sanity through memory and mental discipline, his refusal to internalize the degradation inflicted upon him, his ability to rebuild his life after emancipation, these were all acts of resistance against a system that sought to reduce him to property. to erase his humanity, to make him nothing more than an object of his owner's will. His survival and his testimony challenge simplistic narratives about slavery that focus only on physical resistance or escape, revealing the profound courage required simply to endure, to maintain one's sense of self, to emerge from trauma with the capacity to build a meaningful life. The intervention of Dr. Hendricks illustrates both the possibilities and the severe limitations of individual conscience within an unjust system. Hendricks was not a radical. He was a man working within the legal and social structures of his time, using the tools available to him to address a specific case of extreme abuse. His success in removing Joshua from Margaret Whitmore's control was real and significant. It saved Joshua's life and made his eventual freedom possible, but it did not challenge the institution of slavery itself, did not protect other enslaved people from similar abuse, did not address the systemic injustice that made such cases possible. His story raises difficult questions about the ethics of incremental action within fundamentally unjust systems, about the value of small victories when the larger structure remains intact, about the relationship between individual, moral action and systemic change. These questions remain relevant because the dynamics they illuminate, the abuse of power, the dehumanization of vulnerable populations, the legal frameworks that enable cruelty, the courage required to resist, the limitations of individual intervention persist in different forms. The specific institution of chattel slavery ended with the 13th Amendment, but the psychological patterns, the social structures, and the moral challenges it embodied continue to shape American society. Understanding cases like Joshua's is not merely an exercise in historical knowledge. It is a way of developing the moral imagination necessary to recognize and resist injustice in our own time, to honor the dignity and agency of people who have been systematically dehumanized, and to build systems that prevent the kinds of abuse that slavery made routine and legal. Now, I want to hear from you. What strikes you most about Joshua's story, his survival strategies, Dr. Hendricks' intervention, or the legal system's limitations? How do you think we should remember and honor stories like this in our communities? And what parallels, if any, do you see between the power dynamics of slavery and forms of systemic oppression that exist today? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe these stories deserve to be told and remembered, subscribe to this channel and share this video. The algorithm will only amplify these histories if we engage with them, so your participation is how we ensure that Joshua's survival, his resistance, and his dignity are not forgotten. Remember that behind every historical statistic stood human beings with names, with stories, with extraordinary courage. Honor them by learning their stories, by sharing them, and by continuing the work of building a more just world. Remember Joshua, honor his survival, continue his resistance.